Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone, wherever you might be. Welcome to our holiday edition of All About Nothing. As I was thinking about what to write about today, I was reflecting on my various trips to Cuba and a recent conversation that I had with an old friend. And I've always loved Cuba, partly because I come out of a left-wing political activist tradition. In my first life, I like to think, was all about activism. So Cuba was very important to me as an icon of sort of revolutionary success. And I admit that I idealized Cuba. And always, given my own trauma history and my father's, the way I inherited my father's mixed feelings about not dying and not being martyred, I think I always had this fantasy of being like Che Guevara. And Che was this symbol of a martyr that did so much good to free his people. And he died in a blaze of glory. And that was always kind of my life plan, to die in a blaze of glory, fighting for a good cause. Because I think my father's trauma was that he never quite got over the fact and the guilt about the fact that he was not killed in the Holocaust. So I grew up with that specter kind of floating in the field unconsciously, as is often the case and is often the nature of the intergenerational transmission of trauma. And I remember in my activist days hearing the slogan, Seremos como Che, which is, we will be as Che. And I always had this illusion or this fantasy or this vision of myself and my life as being some kind of martyr hero that would die for a cause. Years later, I had the opportunity to travel to Cuba. Actually, I've been there 4 times, and I've always been someone who loves tropical islands. I love where it's warm. I love where where you have a lot of tropical plants and flowers and fruits and the air and all of it. I just love. And so I was very excited about going to Cuba. And the first time we went was in 2015. And it was shortly after President Obama had visited in Cuba. And it was also shortly after the Rolling Stones had visited in Cuba. And there was kind of this high energy in the air in Cuba. And I should sidebar by saying, as I became more interested in psychology over the years, and my interest was less political and more focused on the individual and psychological within the political and within the macro, I always thought of Cuba kind of like the icon of neglect and abandonment. Because going back to 1959, the Cuban island was pretty much cut off from the world, and the US imposed an embargo on Cuba, which meant that no goods and products and services of any kind could enter Cuba. And pretty soon, most of the world was in on that embargo. So they weren't receiving any goods, any products from anywhere. So Cuba became this quintessential island, child of neglect, where abandoned by everyone, there was nothing to do but rely on themselves. And so that's what they did. And going around Cuba, I would see cars that were the same age as me. I was born in 1955. There are cars driving around that were made in 1955, 56, because after 1959, there were no cars coming from elsewhere. So, what could the Cubans do but go way self reliant and do everything for themselves? So, the Cubans became very, very exquisitely skilled in st- um, in what do we call it now? It's the maintenance of supplies and agriculture that's sustainable. That's the word I was thinking of. Sustainable agriculture and not only recycling, but much more reusing, repurposing. And I noticed in Cuba there were no garbage cans. There was very little trash around. And when you used the bathroom, there was always a bucket next to the bathroom with water so you could flush the toilet with recycled water, and everything was being reused and repurposed and recycled and shared. And I also noticed how if anybody broke down by the side of the road, even a bus, if anybody broke down, there were no repair shops, there were no gas stations at short intervals. So if somebody broke down on the side of the road, somebody else stopped to help them repair and fix what was broken, because they couldn't do it alone and they couldn't count on anyone outside themselves. So the island became this pinnacle, this symbol, this icon of self-reliance, very much like the child of neglect, where there is no alternative but to just hunker down and rely on oneself. So there's a tremendous spirit of interdependence and of helping one another and of making do and repairing and fixing and sustaining and reusing and making do. And in the 80s, when Russia was the Soviet Union, they stepped in and they helped for a while. But then in 1990, even the Russians pulled out. And then the Cubans were completely on their own again, which sounds so similar to the child of neglect, where there is no alternative but to do it all myself, and to do it well, and to do it heroically, all by oneself, because there is no one else. There is no option. And somehow that seemed glorious to me, because they were upholding a certain ethic, a certain vision, a certain ideology, which I really, really identified with. And when we were there, particularly that first time, I remember we were walking in the countryside, and it was this beautiful preserve, because what had happened in the early parts of the 19th century was the colonists had come in and hacked down the forest and planted sugarcane and brought slaves and made use of the land for sugar production and for profit that went out of Cuba. So in 59, when the revolution took hold, they got rid of the colonialists and they replanted those sugarcane fields with trees. And we were walking in that forest, and it was so beautiful. And there were birds and there were flowers. And I remember we saw a man walking, and we talked with him. And come to find out, he was a doctor, and he was doing a home visit. And he said, most of our medical care is with home visits. He said, because I like to see what's going on inside the family, where how do people treat their pets, and what do people feed their children, and how their relationships are, because all of these factors, these interpersonal attachment-oriented factors, were all part of their health assessment. And in Cuba, they were taken care of. All the people were taken care of. Their medical care, their education, their housing, their food were all provided for, like by good parents who took care of everyone, who took care of everyone equally. And it so matched my ideal of how you take care of people. So I was starry-eyed walking around in Cuba. I was starry-eyed by how these people were taking care of each other, taking care of themselves, how the government took care of them. And I was really, really impressed with how people were so kind. And I remember I was talking to this one woman once, and I said to her, I said, you were so kind to us when we treated you so badly. And she turned to me and she said, you didn't treat me badly. It was your government who treated us badly. And I thought, wow, talk about forgiveness, talk about acceptance, talk about being able to see the bigger picture. Talk about breaking the chain of the intergenerational transmission. I was so impressed. And we went back and we visited Cuba again 4 times, my husband and I. And I was so grateful that I had those opportunities to see the island and to see for myself this place, this quintessential symbol of the child of neglect, which I had always idealized. So after the pandemic came and travel to Cuba really kind of changed, and a lot of things have changed in the world, including after Obama, we had a different administration that wasn't nearly as kind and as charitable to Cuba as the Obama administration had been. And I was so grateful that I had been able to visit Cuba during those times that were better times. And as I followed the news, it became harder and harder to get really clear reporting, clear information about what was going on there. So I've been kind of puzzled and uncertain about what to believe about what was going on in the news, what to believe about what was going on in Cuba. And so, fast forward to a few weeks ago, and I saw an old friend of mine who I had not seen in decades. And it was so marvelous to see him again. He was an old friend of mine from my activist days. And he had done a lot of work subsequent to our activist days that were related to Cuba, including consulting to them about financial matters. And he had been to Cuba more than 20 times. So I thought, oh, well, maybe this is a person from whom I can get a really unbiased view of what's been going on in Cuba. So I asked him, and I said, so tell me, what's really going on in Cuba? And he said, well, to tell you the truth, they're sort of stuck in time. He said, and they haven't really been able to accept good counsel, even counsel for someone well-meaning, from someone well-meaning like him, he said. And so they're kind of staying stuck in the past. So economically, they're really having trouble. They're having trouble, sort of going with the times. And so the country's very poor and getting more so. And they're not able to really update their files and move with the times in ways that would be better for them. They are so racked with mistrust that they can't accept good counsel. And it made me think about the bigger question of safety. And this is what's relevant to us in our mission, in our work. And that is that even the most well-meaning counsel, even the most well-meaning people, helpers, like us, like me, and like you, we can't help someone who doesn't feel safe. As long as we're unsafe, there's no way we can risk puncturing the self-reliance which has kept the child of neglect insulated, the self-reliance which the traumatized person, for the most part, must rely on in an unsafe world. So we have no choice but to start with cultivating and growing safety wherever and however we can. And whether we're therapists or clients, children of neglect ourselves, we might be both, like me, like many of you, like many of us. Safety is the bottom line. Safety is the ground zero. Safety is the pinnacle of secure attachment. Safety is the foundation for everything. And without safety, we can't move forward. We can't make progress. The one last thing that I will say as I've become safer and safer through the years is when I saw that painted mural on the wall in Cuba that said, Seremos como Che. In those days, I really kind of took that more to mean not that we must be like Che, which is what the words actually say, but I must be Che, which meant I need to die doing it. And partly it was a dual purpose because I was so unhappy. It would be an excuse. It would be a way to die, which is what I thought was the only hope for me to escape my pain and my trauma. I didn't know there was another way. And now I get it. We can contribute to the world being like Jay without being him. And that is a relatively new discovery for me, that I don't have to die to be enough. We don't have to die. We don't have to give our lives and martyr ourselves to be enough. So I'll say one last thing before we end today, and that is when I thought about what to wear today for this podcast, I was thinking about my first visit to Cuba. And we went to this hotel in Havana. It was a beautiful, historical hotel. And on the grounds, the peacocks walked around free. And they were so beautiful, and they were just strutting around, fanning their beauty freely on the grounds. And I thought, wow, they're so beautiful and they're so free to show themselves. So I decided I would wear this peacock jacket, which I bought in 1998, the first time I presented at a conference in New Orleans, USA in 1998. And I bought this jacket with peacock feathers. So seremos como Che. We don't have to die to be enough. Thank you for joining me today. Bye for now.